What if a 12-year-old girl could bring down a billionaire's empire right at her wedding altar? Inside Manhattan's most luxurious cathedral, 300 of the city's elite gathered to witness the event of the year. The music swelled. The bride's glittering gown swept the aisle and whispers filled the air. But then, a single schoolgirl stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This is the story of Sophie Davis, the cleaning lady's daughter, who turned a fairy tale wedding into the scandal of the decade. Inside the towering marble walls of St. James Cathedral, the air was thick with expectation. 300 of Manhattan's most powerful figures sat shoulder to shoulder, their designer suits and glittering gowns forming a sea of wealth beneath the soaring stained glass windows. At the altar, Victoria Sterling stood in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver, a $50,000 masterpiece that trailed across the velvet carpet. At 42, the billionaire businesswoman was the picture of triumph. Her icy blue eyes fixed on Richard Blackwood, the real estate mogul who would soon become her husband. Photographers hovered discreetly near the back, ready to immortalize what had been called the wedding of the decade. The cathedral's organ swelled, the judge raised his hands, and all was set for vows that would bind together not just two people, but two empires. Then the unthinkable happened. From the back of the cathedral, a small voice rose above the music. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. Heads turned as a 12-year-old girl stepped into the central aisle, her scuffed sneakers sinking into the red velvet carpet. She wore no jewels, no silk or satin, only the faded plaid uniform of a public school. Her brown hair was tied back hastily, as if she had rushed here without warning. Yet there she stood, small in stature but unshaken, her gaze fixed on the woman at the altar. A ripple of gasps passed through the crowd, elegant hands flying to lips painted crimson, whispers darting like fire through the pews. The organist froze, fingers suspended mid-note. Security guards shifted in confusion, waiting for the bride's command. The girl's voice, trembling yet determined, echoed through the cathedral. "This woman can't get married. She lied to everyone. I know who you really are." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The bride's face hardened, her flawless smile cracking at the edges. Victoria Sterling turned slowly, the fabric of her gown whispering against the marble floor. Her eyes narrowed, meeting the child's unflinching stare. "Who let this child in here?" she hissed, her words sharp as broken glass. But her voice carried a quiver that did not go unnoticed. Richard Blackwood blinked in confusion, his gaze darting between his radiant bride and the girl who had just fractured the ceremony. The guests leaned forward, hungry for scandal, their phones discreetly rising to capture the unfolding drama. That girl was Sophie Davis, daughter of Carmen, the cleaning lady who had spent 7 long years scrubbing the polished floors of Sterling. Tower. Every morning before the sun rose, while the city still slept, Carmen dragged herself to the 30-story skyscraper to make it shine before the executives arrived. To them, she was invisible, just another worker, unseen and unacknowledged. And to them, Sophie was even less than that, a child from the margins, someone whose life would never touch theirs. Yet here she was, standing in the heart of their world, threatening to bring it all crashing down. Sophie had not come here on a whim. She remembered nights when she crept past her mother's bedroom door only to hear muffled sobs hidden beneath a pillow. She remembered the frustration etched in Carmen's face when the bills piled up, when medicine had to be skipped, when new shoes were put off because food came first. But most of all, Sophie remembered the day she stumbled upon secrets never meant for her eyes or ears. Secrets that explained the shadows clinging to Victoria Sterling's empire. Secrets too dark to be hidden behind diamonds and philanthropic speeches. She knew her mother had sacrificed every ounce of her body to keep them afloat. Yet the very woman who benefited from Carmen's silence was about to stand before God and the city's elite, cloaked in a lie. Sophie could not let that happen. As she stood in the center aisle, her small frame framed by towering marble columns, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Her knees trembled, but her resolve did not. She thought of the documents she had seen, the phone call she had overheard, the evidence that burned like fire in her memory. Her mother had told her again and again that the rich lived on another planet, a universe where power and privilege insulated them from consequence. But Sophie was no longer content to remain invisible, no longer willing to watch her mother suffer while the powerful pretended to be saints. Victoria's voice rose, shrill and unsteady. "Security! Remove this child immediately," she barked, but the guards hesitated, drawn to the spectacle like everyone else. The murmurs of the guests grew louder, a symphony of disbelief and anticipation. Sophie took a breath so deep it seemed to fill her whole body with courage. Her voice rang out, once more cutting through the noise, carried by something greater than her size or her age. "I know the truth, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her eyes locked on the bride's, "and everyone here deserves to know it too." The cathedral fell silent again, heavy with the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. The girl, who was supposed to be invisible, had become impossible to ignore, and the perfect world Victoria Sterling had crafted was beginning to tremble at its foundations. Sophie Davis, the daughter of a cleaning lady, had just declared war on a billionaire at her own wedding, and nothing in that cathedral or beyond would ever be the same. The story of Sophie's bold interruption did not begin inside the cathedral, but many weeks earlier, on a night that seemed as ordinary as any other. Her mother, Carmen, had fallen ill with a heavy flu. Fever burned through her body, but she insisted she could not afford to miss work at Sterling Tower, where she cleaned the executive floors long after the powerful had left for the day. Sophie, only 12, watched her mother cough into her sleeve, dragging herself toward the door with the same weary determination she had carried for years. That night, Sophie made a decision. If her mother could not work, then she would go in her place. She slipped into Carmen's oversized uniform, clutching her mother's worn-out ID card, and made her way to the glittering skyscraper that dominated the Manhattan skyline. The tower, after dark, was a different world, quiet, almost eerie. The offices of the elite stretched high above her, their walls lined with glass and gold. Sophie pushed her cleaning cart down empty corridors, her heart pounding with both fear and pride. She thought only of helping her mother, of sparing her a night of pain. But fate had other plans. As she made her way toward Victoria Sterling's private office, Sophie froze at the sound of a voice drifting through the half-open door. It was Victoria herself, her tone sharp and commanding, carrying easily across the silent floor. Sophie ducked behind the cart, her small frame hidden in shadow. She should have walked away, but the words that followed rooted her to the spot. "Yes, the Hope Foundation account is secure," Victoria said, her voice calm, as if she were discussing a business deal over cocktails. $23 million has already been moved. The rest will be funneled through the tax havens before the quarter ends. No, there's no risk. The charities are just shells. Even the politicians are covered. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of the Hope Foundation before. It was Victoria's pride and joy, a charitable organization praised for its work with underprivileged children. Sophie's school had even received supplies stamped with its logo. But here was the billionaire herself, speaking of it as a tool to launder money. Cartel money, if Sophie understood correctly. She pressed her back against the wall, trembling. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Victoria's words spilled on, darker with every sentence. "The cartel trusts me because I deliver results. The judges are in our pocket. The donations are untouchable. We're too big to touch." Then the line clicked off, and silence returned to the office. Sophie's heart pounded so loudly she thought Victoria might hear it. Shaking, she pulled her mother's old phone from her pocket and pressed record, her fingers fumbling. She leaned closer, snapping photographs of the documents spread carelessly. Across the desk, ledgers filled with coded transfers, offshore bank accounts, names of politicians who appeared untouchable. She captured every scrap she could, each click of the shutter another piece of evidence that could shatter a billionaire's empire. When she finally slipped out of the office, her knees were weak, but her resolve was strong. She knew what she had just uncovered was dangerous, maybe even deadly. But she also knew that her mother had worked too long in silence, cleaning the messes of people who thought they were above the law. Someone had to speak. Later that night, Sophie sat at the edge of her mother's bed, the glow of the phone screen illuminating her frightened face. She played back the recording, and Carmen's expression shifted from confusion to horror. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the enormity of what her daughter had stumbled upon. "Sophie, this is dangerous," Carmen whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you know what she could do to us if she finds out?" Sophie reached for her hand, her young eyes steady with a courage far beyond her years. "But Mama, she's hurting people. She's lying to everyone. We can't keep this secret." For days, Carmen wrestled with fear, her instincts screaming to protect her child. Finally, she made a choice that terrified her as much as it freed her. She contacted James Mitchell, one of New York's most respected investigative journalists, a man whose Pulitzer-winning reports had toppled politicians and exposed corruption that stretched to the highest offices. When Carmen handed him the recordings and the photographs, James listened in silence, his brow furrowed, his eyes darkening with every passing minute. By the time the last audio clip played, James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "This," he said quietly, "is enough to bring her down. And not just her. These documents link her to judges, to senators, to people who've been untouchable for decades. If this gets out, it could shake the city to its core." He looked at Sophie, astonished at the bravery of the child sitting across from him. "Do you understand what you've uncovered?" She nodded, her small fists clenched in determination. She can't hide anymore. James began his own verification, contacting sources, cross-checking the ledgers, tracing the offshore accounts. Within days, every word Victoria had spoken was confirmed. The Hope Foundation was no sanctuary for the poor. It was a fortress for laundering cartel money, built on lies and hidden behind smiling photographs and charity galas. Carmen wanted to stay silent, to let James take the evidence and protect her daughter from retaliation. But Sophie shook her head. "If I stay quiet, she'll just say it's fake. She'll blame someone else. But if I speak at her wedding, in front of everyone, she can't deny it. Not with the whole world watching." Her voice carried the conviction of someone who had already made her choice. Carmen wept, begging her to reconsider, but Sophie's resolve did not waver. She had seen the truth, she had gathered the proof, and she was ready to risk everything. As the day of the wedding approached, the girl who was supposed to be invisible prepared herself for the moment that would either destroy her or change the world. Because Sophie Davis knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she spoke the truth at Victoria Sterling's wedding, in front of the city's elite, the woman could not silence her, and the lie could never be buried again. The hush inside St. James Cathedral had grown unbearable, every heartbeat echoing louder than the organ that had fallen silent. All eyes were locked on the small figure standing in the aisle, a child in a school uniform who dared to speak against one of the most powerful women in New York. Sophie's voice, though young, carried a force that seemed to rattle the stained glass windows. "You can't marry him," she declared, her words sharp as steel. "Not when you've laundered $23 million through fake charities." The name of the figure, the exact number, the sheer precision of her accusation struck the guests like a thunderclap. Gasps filled the air, champagne glasses slipped from trembling hands, and whispers turned to frantic chatter. Richard Blackwood turned toward his bride with a face pale as marble, his jaw tightening as the weight of suspicion pressed against him. Victoria's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. She forced a laugh, high and brittle, raising her hands as if to calm the storm. "This child doesn't know what she's talking about," she said, her voice echoing across the pews. "She's clearly disturbed. Perhaps her mother put her up to this. You all know me. I've dedicated my life to helping children in need." But Sophie did not back down. She stepped closer to the altar, her sneakers squeaking against the polished marble. The phones of 100 guests rose higher, recording every second of the spectacle. "You said it yourself," Sophie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I have the proof. Do you want them to hear it?" Her small fingers clutched a phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Victoria's flawless mask faltered, a flicker of panic breaking through her icy control. Then Sophie pressed play. The cathedral filled with the unmistakable sound of Victoria Sterling's voice, crisp and cold, magnified through the speakers. "23 million has already been moved. The rest will be funneled through the tax havens before the quarter ends. No, there's no risk. The charities are just shells. Even the politicians are covered." The sound ricocheted off the vaulted ceilings, every syllable sinking like poison into the glittering crowd. The guests erupted in pandemonium, some gasping, some shouting, others rushing to the exits as if proximity alone might taint them. Reporters in the back scrambled forward, their cameras flashing, their microphones raised. Richard Blackwood recoiled from his bride as if she were aflame, his hand falling away from hers, his voice low but deadly clear. "This wedding is over." Victoria's carefully constructed empire of charm and glamour cracked in an instant. Her smile twisted. Her eyes darted wildly as she tried to regain control. "This is fake," she cried, pointing at Sophie with trembling hands. "Do you think I'd ever say something like that? She's lying. Someone has manipulated this audio." But before the crowd could absorb her denial, Sophie stepped forward once more. "I'm not lying, and I'm not finished." From her school bag, she pulled out printed photographs, the ledgers she had captured, documents showing account numbers, Cayman Islands transfers, and names of senators and judges scribbled in neat handwriting. She held them high for the cameras now flooding the aisle, their flashes painting her small figure in bursts of white light. "She wanted to marry Richard Blackwood," Sophie continued, her voice breaking with emotion, "because she needed him as a shield. She planned to use his name, his reputation to protect herself when the investigation started. She was never marrying him for love. He was just her cover." The words struck Richard like a blade. His face hardened, his lips pressed into a grim line as he stepped back from Victoria, leaving her alone before the altar. The billionaire, once radiant in her $50,000 gown, suddenly seemed diminished, her beauty fading beneath the weight of betrayal and fear. Murmurs rose into shouts, guests standing on their feet, some demanding explanations, others rushing to capture the moment on their phones. The cathedral had become a courtroom, and Victoria Sterling stood accused before her peers, her jury made up of the very elite she once commanded. Sophie's final blow came with a second recording, played aloud for every ear in the cathedral to hear. Victoria's voice again, colder this time. "With Richard, no one will touch me. He's connected, respected. By the time anyone questions the accounts, we'll be untouchable together." The gasp that followed was deafening. There was no room left for denial. The bride's perfect facade had shattered, revealing the ruthless woman beneath. Victoria staggered, her hands clawing at the air as if she could grasp back the life slipping from her. Her voice cracked, rising into a scream. "This is a setup. You're all fools if you believe this child." But the crowd was no longer with her. They had seen the proof, heard her voice, and watched her unravel in real time. The empire she had built over decades was collapsing in seconds, and she could do nothing to stop it. In the back of the cathedral, unnoticed by most, James Mitchell had slipped in with a camera crew, His eyes locked on Sophie with a mixture of awe and pride as he signaled for the live feed to begin. In moments, the footage streamed across the nation, the scandal exploding far beyond the cathedral's walls. News tickers lit up screens across the city. Billionaire bride exposed in cathedral showdown. As chaos consumed the wedding of the decade, one truth became clear. The invisible girl had turned the altar into a battlefield, and Victoria Sterling's empire was crumbling not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in front of the world, with a child as her executioner. Victoria Sterling's desperate cries echoed through the cathedral, but no one rushed to her side. The very guards who had once shielded her from scrutiny now restrained her trembling arms, holding back the woman who had ruled with untouchable authority. Her diamond tiara glittered under the cathedral lights, but it no longer symbolized power. It looked instead like the final ornament of a fallen queen. "Please, listen, I can explain," she wailed, her voice cracking with fear. But explanations had no place in the storm of evidence that now surrounded her. The grand wooden doors of St. James Cathedral burst open with a thud that silenced even the chaos. A team of federal agents in dark suits strode down the aisle, their badges gleaming. The letters were unmistakable: FBI. The crowd parted in shock, whispers rippling like wildfire. The lead agent spoke firmly, his words reverberating through the cathedral. "Victoria Sterling, you are under arrest for money, laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy." The billionaire who once bent politicians to her will was now reduced to a trembling prisoner. Her wrists were bound in cold steel as cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the image of a woman who had believed herself untouchable. In the weeks that followed, her downfall spread like a firestorm across the nation. The trial was relentless. Every shred of evidence laid bare before the world. Sophie's recordings, photographs, and testimony painted a picture of greed and corruption so deep it shook even the most cynical. Former allies fled, distancing themselves from the woman who had once hosted them in penthouses and yacht parties. Victoria Sterling, once celebrated as a philanthropist and Queen of Wall Street, was sentenced to 25 years in federal EU prison. Her empire, once valued in the billions, crumbled into ashes, its assets seized, its legacy erased, but Victoria was not the only one to fall. 17 others were indicted alongside her, senators who had protected her, judges who had turned blind eyes, cartel contacts who had supplied the money that flowed through her fake charities. One by one, they were dragged into courtrooms, their names tarnished forever. The web of corruption unraveled, and for the first time, the public saw that even the highest towers could collapse. Amid the rubble of one woman's empire, a new story began to rise. Carmen Davis, who had once scrubbed floors in silence, found herself holding a letter from the FBI. Inside was a check for $200,000, a reward for the evidence that had helped dismantle one of the largest laundering operations in the country. With trembling hands and tears streaming down her cheeks, Carmen embraced her daughter. For the first time in years, the weight of survival lifted. She invested the money not in luxury, but in dignity. Within months, she launched her own cleaning company, a business that grew quickly and employed 15 women, mothers, widows, immigrants, who, like her, had been invisible too long. Sophie, the girl who had dared to speak in the cathedral, became a symbol larger than herself. Richard Blackwood, humbled by the truth and grateful for his narrow escape, established a scholarship in her name. It ensured Sophie would have the best education possible, a path to a future her mother could only have dreamed of. Newspapers. Across the globe ran her photograph, the small figure in a school uniform standing at the altar, her eyes burning with courage. She became a voice for children everywhere who felt powerless, a reminder that age was no barrier to truth. James Mitchell, the journalist who had taken her evidence to the world, won another Pulitzer Prize. Yet in every interview, he refused to claim the spotlight alone. "The award belongs to Sophie Davis," he said. "I only carried her truth into print. She was the one brave enough to speak it aloud." His words immortalized her not just as a whistleblower but as an icon of justice. Letters poured in from A's. Across the world, children writing to say they were no longer afraid to speak up, parents thanking Sophie for showing that silence was not the only option. She became the spark for a wave of courage that rippled far beyond Manhattan. Schools taught her story, activists carried her name into rallies, and she stood on stages telling the world that courage has no age, and truth cannot be silenced. And so the invisible child became unforgettable. She had brought down a billionaire, toppled an empire, and exposed a system that thrived on silence. But more than that, she gave hope to millions who had been told their voices did not matter. Standing on the steps of Sterling Tower, now stripped of its name and sold off piece by piece, Sophie spoke softly into the cameras. "I wasn't supposed to be here. People like me aren't supposed to be seen or heard. But I've learned that the truth doesn't care who speaks it. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud." The world listened, and the world believed. The story closed not with a wedding kiss, but with the clang of prison doors, the rise of new beginnings, and the echo of a child's courage. The narrator's voice lingered over the image of Sophie walking beside her mother, no longer invisible, but radiant with purpose. The invisible child became the voice that destroyed a $23 million empire. She proved courage has no age, and truth cannot be silenced. And as the camera pulled back from the cathedral that had seen both the height of power and its collapse, one final thought remained. This was not just the end of a wedding. It was the beginning of a revolution,